Hi, my name is Alp. I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. Recently, I've been working with many customers on their Synapse adoption and deployment. Customers, understandably, want to deploy their Synapse environment in a secure manner as possible. So in this video, I want to augment the existing Microsoft Synapse documentation, as well as this great blog written by my friend Benjamin Leroux in Canada. I highly recommend visiting his site, dataguy.com, to get you up to speed on your Synapse deployment. In this video, I specifically want to take this existing architecture diagram and show you how you can achieve this secure deployment leveraging private endpoints in the Azure portal. So let's get started. In order to access your Synapse Studio web UI, you do need to create a private link hub. Once you create the private link hub, you need to create a private endpoint with a sub-target web. You also need to create another private endpoint that will connect to your Azure Synapse workspace. These two private endpoints will be in your customer VNet. Now, if I was to drill down one level lower, once we have that initial setup, what we need to do is to make sure that we create private endpoints to our storage account, as well as create managed service identity from our serverless and our dedicated SQL pool to our storage account as well. So let's go into the Azure portal and let's see how we can make that happen. Okay, I'm in the Azure portal. As you can see, I've already created a resource group, Contoso Synapse Private. I've also created a Synapse workspace, as well as a private link hub. Before I go into the Synapse workspace, however, I do want to show you that during the workspace creation, what you need to watch out for. So let's go ahead and create a new Synapse workspace. Okay, I'm going to skip over the basics and security and really just get to the networking part, because there is something there that I do want to show you that becomes a crucial factor in setting up your private endpoints. Okay, managed virtual network. Choose whether you want a Synapse managed virtual network dedicated to your Synapse workspace. So you definitely want to turn this on. If you do not turn this on, your managed private endpoints will be grayed out in your Synapse Studio. In addition, you will not be able to create a private endpoint to your Azure Data Lake. So if you fail to do this during the Synapse workspace creation, you will not be able to change this later, and you'll be forced to recreate the Synapse workspace. So that's definitely something to watch out for. All right, let's go ahead and exit out of here and go back into our resource group. All right, now the first thing I want to show you is the firewall rules. You can see right now that I've got a 76.126.75.94 address. If I delete this firewall rule, I will not be able to access my Synapse Studio web UI from my laptop. Okay, so I am deleting this, and this will remove the firewall rule to allow my client IP address to access the Synapse Studio. Now what we'll do is, once this rule takes place, we'll go back into the overview blade and try to launch the workspace. And you can see here the workspace web URL is web.azuresynapse.net. That is a public URL. Now you can see that the fire rule has taken into place. So if I click on it, what's going to happen is I'm going to get errors. Okay, so it's looking at my IP address. It's saying, hey, that's not part of the firewall rule. You've also seemed to set up private endpoints. I don't know what's going on. So you get this error message. And if I were to click into view details, you can see that client IP address is not authorized. So right now, this is completely blocked from all traffic. Okay, so this would be the behavior if you remove that firewall rule. Okay, let's do a couple other things. I'm going to go ahead and add that client IP back, save it, and then what I'll do is we'll relaunch that web workspace, and you'll get an idea of kind of the expected behavior. Okay, so let's go back into overview. Let's go back into the workspace web URL and click on it. And by the way, you can see that my managed virtual network is yes. So that's what I was showing you earlier in the demo. You do need to make sure that is turned on, okay? Now, what you're seeing here is some of the private endpoint connections. You can see that I've got one for dev. This one gives you access to the Synapse Studio, the serverless, and then the SQL is for the dedicated SQL. Now, if I go and click new private endpoint, what I'm going to want to do here is create a private endpoint for my web UI, okay? So this is where the private link hub comes into play. So if I go into my resource type and type in the private link hub, you guys see the private link hub there because we created that object, private link hub, and my target sub-resource becomes the web. If I do not do this part, I cannot access my Synapse web UI through a private endpoint, okay? So I need to go back one step. You see that I failed to put West US 2 on the region because that's where I had deployed this, and it's having a hard time finding my customer VNet. So let's get that rectified. Let's go back into configuration, and I'm going to go and find our Contoso private. There we go. And that's the customer VNet that we're going to deploy this on. Okay, so these will be the steps that are necessary. Now, I am going to exit out of here, but you do need to go through these steps. And what's interesting is once you do go through these steps, the private endpoint for the web is not created there. What happens is it actually gets created on the private link hub. So if you do go through this process and you don't see that entry, don't be alarmed. That entry is actually going into the Synapse private link hub. So you can see that this has been approved. So now I can access my web UI through a private endpoint, okay? And if I go into that private endpoint, my private endpoint web, you can see under DNS configuration that it's been deployed as a web.privatelink.azuresynapse.net, and it's going to have an IP address of 10.7.0.8. Okay, and I'm going to demonstrate that a little bit later for you. Okay, now that we've enabled our firewall rules, let's go back and let's go and relaunch the studio again. This time our firewall rule is in place, so I will not get any error messages when I go to this public URL, web.azuresynapse.net. As you can see, it's launching, and I'm going to be able to successfully enter the URL. All right, so you can see I'm successfully entered. There's no error messages that are popping up. If I go and click on manage, you can see that my serverless is online and ready for me to query. Next thing I'm going to do is go to my database or data hub, and I'm going to go into linked services. You can see I've got my storage account, my data lake gen 2 available to me. I've got a couple of sample files in there. I'm going to go and do a serverless query. Let's go and run this just to show you that it is functional, okay? And give that a moment for the query to come back. You can see it's just some fictitious random accounts receivable data, okay? So now, the other thing I want to show you is under my manage private endpoints, if I had not deployed the Synapse workspace with the managed virtual network, I would not have these entries, okay? So you do get the SQL Synapse workspace and you get the SQL on-demand workspace as well. And if you click on new, I've created one to our Azure Data Lake, Contoso ADLS, as you saw earlier, okay? Now, I want to show you guys one last thing. So we still have this firewall rule open, right? And if I go into my Contoso VNet, this is the customer VNet. What I've done is I've carved out a /22 workspace, about 1,020 something IPs. You can see you can see some of the private endpoints that have been deployed here, right? Like our serverless, our SQL, our web, and then you see I've got a Contoso desktop in there as well, right? So we're gonna go and actually access that Contoso desktop. And then what we're going to do is we're going to actually access our Synapse workspace privately. So we're going to remove the firewall entirely, and we're going to access our Synapse workspace through a private IP. Okay, I'm going to demonstrate that to you as the next part of this. So I'm going to go ahead and download that RDP, go and launch this. I'm going to pause the video momentarily, just log in and get into the to this virtual machine here. Okay. Okay, so I'm in this virtual machine. As you can see, I've got a 20.94.235.132 address on top, as you can see. I've already logged into the Azure portal. I'm in the Contoso Synapse workspace again. I'm going to go back into firewall rules. You can see that we've got all the firewall rules are eliminated. Okay, you can see that it's saying, hey, do you want to add this virtual machine and add a firewall rule? I don't actually want to do that. What I want to do is just go ahead and launch the web.azuresynapse.net, right? And let's see what happens. So you can see there's no firewall rules. However, I am in that same virtual network, the customer network. Same one as that we've got the private endpoints to connect to our web.azuresynapse.net. All right, so you see that it's successful. I didn't get any errors. Let's go back and run that same query that we ran a little bit earlier. I'm going to go into that accounts receivable file, right click, do a top 100, run my serverless, and I'm going to get some results back, okay? Now, as you can see below, I got my results back. Okay, so the part that I want to show you is, now if I go to NSLOOKUP and I do web.azuresynapse.net, what's gonna come back to me is that private IP of 10.7.0.8. So look at that, NSLOOKUP, web.azuresynapse.net. Azure Synapse.net, you can see that translates to 10.7.0.8. Okay, so that is the private endpoint that we deployed the web private endpoint for. And you can see now I'm communicating privately with my Synapse Studio and Synapse Studio UI. Okay, I am just going to show you one last thing just to kind of prove that last point. Okay, so you can see I've got my private endpoint. Remember the private endpoint web that we created for the Synapse Private Link Hub? Do you see the address? 10.7.0.8. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this video. I just wanted to show you some of the things that you need to watch out for if you want to privately connect to your Synapse Studio and you want to stop access from the public internet.